Hello everyone, welcome to the fifth seminar of the course, and today my name's Rory Ridley-Duff. You'll have seen my introduction, I guess. This is the first time I've given you a lecture though, so I'm going to be talking about values, principles, and I'm going to use the cooperative movement as an example of how values are put into practice, and also our own variant of cooperative values and principles at the FairShares Institute. And we'll be doing a role play on FairShares. So this is your first lecture where you get some solid information about the background to FairShares and how we are connecting it to the cooperative movement's values and principles. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at how values arise. I'm particularly interested in sort of aggregated value systems that we consider to be paradigms, a way of looking at the world through a particular set of values, principles, stories, symbols. Yeah. And when these aggregate together, they constitute a normative system and lead to institutionalized behaviors. So we'll be looking at what I mean by normative cultures. The cooperative movement is a diverse movement, but it has agreed values and principles. So it's good for using as an example. It goes beyond a single business to a whole business movement. And we'll look at how they are connecting to sustainable development. And that's primarily through initiatives that are taken at the global level, but also through our own work on the FairShares Institute, or the FairShares model. So, values emerge from culture is the argument I'm going to say here. There are what we might consider intangibles, symbols, stories, routines, rituals. They don't have anything physical beyond our reading of texts, our telling of stories, and habits that we get. We call these the soft issues. And then there are physical structures, social power structures, control systems that may be through culture, but also physical control systems that enable you to get to some places and not others. And we consider these to be the hard issues. So there's obviously a relationship between the soft issues, how we articulate things and how we put them into practice. But if you take these all together, we get a set of taken for granted assumptions that we can regard as a paradigm of thinking. So we'll look at this in the abstract, values in society, the propagation of values, and then the concrete expression of these within the cooperative movement and the FairShares subset of that movement. I found it useful to tell this story. Yeah, so Graham Duncan. I worked with Graham Duncan for over 3 years on a project in the local community where we were trying to find out why Pakistani women struggle to create businesses. And in the first instance, Graham chose a story from Pakistan of a Pakistani businessman who came to the UK, and he told the story of the Pakistani businessman coming to the UK and creating a food business. And what he found is that the people in his audience, the local Pakistani women, didn't relate to the story because the story was about a man. And in Pakistani culture, there's much more separation between men and women in day-to-day life than there is in Western culture. So they couldn't relate to the story as something that was within their own experience or possible for them. And this was an incredibly useful learning experience, because what it means is that if you tell a story, if you're trying to communicate through stories, it only works with people who have cultural experiences similar to your own. If they don't have cultural experiences similar to your own, you have to create new stories with people. So we had to change our track in this particular project in order to get stories from the participants in the research project and learn their stories and participate in their stories and create new stories with them by doing things with them. And a lot of stuff that's written about heroic leadership and these wonderful leaders who tell these great stories, it only works if your audience is already part of your culture. If they're not, you need to have a different leadership culture. You need to create joint experiences and experience things with people so that you can create common reference points. So stories and the experiences that we have in generating them and telling them create norms. And norms relate to the behaviours and attitudes that we expect. So a normative culture is one where you have values that are implicit and against which people's attitudes and behaviours can be judged. So you can take issue with somebody's attitude as well as with their behaviour. They might have a particular attitude to learning that you think is unproductive, and you take issue with the attitude. Powell and DiMaggio did very important work on a body of knowledge that's now called institutional theory, and what they showed is how institutional attitudes, institutional behaviours are spread within organisations and across organisations. So this might be voluntary, it might be or coercively. And they called this process isomorphism, the gradual process by which normalisation takes place. The coercive is imposed by external parties, so by government through regulation, or the stock market, or professional bodies, or industry bodies who tell people in their industry how they must do things and how they must behave. Normative is slightly different in that it's more emergent from people's experience, having a debate about what your professional values are and then adopting those professional values would be a normative process. So what the CIPD does in the field of HR would be considered an example of normative. And then lastly, mimetic, where you're copying. So you're copying other people because either you admire the way that they behave and you want to be like them, or maybe they are admired and you just don't want to appear different. So you mimic or you ape their behaviours in order to be accepted. So there's some good work that's been done around that. Now, the fact that there is a value system, a set of ethics that's operating within an organisation or a wider culture, doesn't mean that everybody agrees with them. Indeed, Kelman's work, and although this work is quite old, I think it's good work, and I've used it in some of my own work. He argues that either people comply for fear of what will happen to them if they don't comply. They identify with the person who is stating the values. So you might like that person, you might like that institution, and you want to be recognise them, part of them. So it doesn't mean you necessarily hold the values, but because you want to be accepted by that person or that institution, you identify with those values and you act in accordance with them. But at the deepest level, we internalise the values. We think about them, we think whether they're good to hold or not good to hold, and we act in accordance with them because we want to and because we think that other people should. And it's this internalisation of values that stays with us permanently and changes slowly over the course of our lifetime. So there are processes in society that create durable value systems, and that does not mean that there's a single value system. Some of my own work in understanding communitarian perspectives on the governance of companies and organisations differentiated unitarism from pluralism, so accepting diversity versus trying to get everybody to accept a shared set of behaviours and attitudes. And then also the degree to which you believe that the collective should be in control or individuals should be in control. So freedom and freedom of association, freedom of thought is very much associated with individual rights and individuality. Communitarianism argues that we're individuals shaped by our community values and norms, and therefore our individuality is not just our own. It's the characteristics of the group are imprinted on us as we learn the language, the culture, the norms, the stories, the rituals. Cooperative governance tends to be in the lower area, and there are cooperative cultures that are very diverse and tolerant, and there are cooperative cultures that are not so diverse and tolerant. There's a spectrum running across here. So when I talk about the cooperative movement, you'll find quite a lot of difference amongst people in the cooperative movement as to whether we should have a more unitary or pluralist approach to cooperativism. So I'm going to focus in this area, and we'll look at the values and principles in the cooperative movement as an example. So just a little bit of background. They begin to appear in society and in our records at the late 18th century. They spread to America, they spread to Japan in the early 19th century. In the UK, by 1908, there were 9.5 million members of mutuals and friendly societies. So cooperative stores sold goods and services, and friendly societies looked after our well-being. They protected us when we were out of work and if we needed healthcare. That's about half the working population, that, by the way. So it was quite considerable movement. The principles, the values, are traced back to a particular group of people in 1844 called the Rochdale Pioneers. And their principles were encoded and agreed by an international movement in 1937 and revised again in 1966 and 1995. Now, we don't see co-ops a great deal in the UK, but globally they're quite similar. So the largest 300 co-ops have an economy, if you collectively, the size of a developed country. So 2.4 trillion is like France. It's a considerable contribution to the global economy. So the original principles were open membership, so people are not customers, they're members, which is different. There's democratic control, people can vote on the choices that need to be made. You distribute profits according to trade rather than your financial contribution. So in a private company, you put money in and then you get money back in proportion to the money you put in. In a co-op, it depends how much I buy from the co-op as to how much I get out or how much I work there in terms of how much I get as a share of any surplus or profit. And then there's views about political and religious neutrality, not offering credit because you don't want to indebt people, and promoting education so that people understand about co-ops and how to operate a co-op. So like I said, they're revised in 66 and 95. We're going to look at a few of the latest ones, but I want to encourage you to use this link, and there's a guidance documents you can download to look at the principles and how they have evolved over time. Now I'm just going to play you a video. I might need to, yes, we're using Screen-O-Matic. So this YouTube video will introduce you to the movement, and I've included this chart here to show you that Asia, most cooperative members live in Asia, which is not surprising considering the population is so big there, but a higher proportion of people are involved in agricultural co-ops and the food products. They exist in Europe too, so if you buy Cravendale milk, Anchor butter, we'll see later, these are produced by co-ops in Europe. So let's have a look at an introductory video. It's created by the United Nations to celebrate the achievements of the cooperative movement and to raise their profile. So I shall maximize the screen. Let's kick it off. It's obviously taking a while to load, just bear with me. Come on, doesn't normally take this long. Let's try again. Okay. So you'll notice it made a claim of 100 million jobs. That was a substantial underestimate. The 2017 study showed that globally it's closer to 300 million people. So we're only just beginning to come to terms with how large the cooperative movement is. So let's move to a little bit more. So it's not just the co-op group. You've probably seen co-op stores in the UK. People think that the co-op stores are the cooperative movement. But if you've bought fair trade coffee, bananas, sugar, 75% of those goods come from cooperatives, mostly in Africa and Asia. Have you bought Arla products, Cravendale milk, Anchor butter? Arla is the 9th largest dairy producer in the world. If you've got a mortgage or a bank account or insurance products with Nationwide, you're a member of a co-op. I saw them at the 2016 International Summit in Quebec. They were on a panel talking with other cooperative businesses. And credit unions. We don't have many in the UK, but in Ireland, everybody's got a credit union account in Ireland. They're all members of a cooperative financial institution. In America, it's half the population. In Canada, it's about 44%. So substantial presence in financial services. So let's have a little bit more of a look at the International Cooperative Alliance Values and Principles. This is just a precursor to you doing your own study. and then we'll look at the FairShares connection to them. So on the values side, self-help, self-responsibility, democracy, equality, equity, solidarity. And on the ethics side, honesty, openness, social responsibility, and caring for others. And interestingly, the person who is credited with translating these into principles wanted to call the operationalization of values and ethics as practices, but was overruled by the movement. So let's take a couple, one value, one ethic, and I'll take a couple of the principles as well. So self-help and self-responsibility originally was the responsibility of members to fund their own business. So they couldn't go to the stock market, they couldn't go to a bank to borrow money. So what they did is they collectively saved. About 250 people in Rochdale all saved up £1. They might have been subscribing a few pence a week. £1 was quite a lot of money then. It was a week and a half's wages. Now, the criticism in the guidance here is that a lot of co-ops are still only charging £1. So the co-op group today still only charges you £1 to join. So they've gone from asking you for a week and a half's wages to asking you for less than the price of a cup of coffee. You can work out for yourself what £1 would be worth in today's money and how much money that might raise if that member fee was still charged. And also you think about what would you want if you were paying this membership fee? What would you want in return? And how might a membership fee inhibit open membership as well? The movement thinks that lowering the entry devalues membership and creates a danger that the self-help principle is not applied. So it might be that you go and try and fundraise from other people, or you borrow money rather than building up your own resources. Openness. This is one of the ethics. So self-regulation needs to be open and transparent. The goal is to be so transparent that you don't need state regulation. So there's light touch regulation of co-ops because they do good governance. There are limits to that. Commercial sensitivities, regulatory requirements may require you to keep information private. Employee records would need to be kept private, for example. But in Mondragon, it's interesting that they have what they call a watchdog council. Sometimes it's called the audit committee. They're elected and they have to monitor the conduct of management, the governing body. They have to audit financial information, make sure that it's accurate before it goes to members for decisions to be made. Now, there's a lot of openness here. So at what point does the amount of openness compromise your ability to remain autonomous? I think it's a question for you to think about. So the guidance includes its discussion of the principles, but the values and ethics are always discussed in each of the chapters on the principles. So here are the principles: voluntary open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy still there, education still there, cooperation amongst cooperatives and concern for communities. So this is the 1995 agreement on cooperative principles. And you might want to look at the work of particular people. So Mervyn Wilson, Linda Shaw, Sonia Novkovic are all solid academics. They've got a track record of publishing, and you can go and follow up their work when you're doing your essay. So a couple of the principles: voluntary open membership. So comes from the fundamental human right of freedom of association to join with other people in the common pursuit of particular goals. And the guidance is interesting because it says that if it's coercive, if it's compulsory, then it's meaningless. And also, if you force people out, that's a breach of the principle. So people might have to leave because they no longer have a qualifying relationship. They don't buy their goods or services from the co-op anymore, therefore they can't be a member. But if you force somebody out who is otherwise qualifies for membership, then that's a breach of the principle. Democratic member control, everybody having a vote. In the 19th century, when this was introduced, this was a radical change. So it didn't depend on having property, it didn't depend on being a man as opposed to a woman. They extended membership to women at a time when women had no political voice or rights. So that was a statement of how organisations should behave and be run. It was a normative value. They also recognised that multi-stakeholder co-ops, which FairShares, which we're going to go on and discuss, is an example of a multi-stakeholder co-op. They might have a different voting system where the size of the group is taken into account, or you might want to balance the interests of different stakeholders irrespective of their size as well, because the interests are important, not just the numbers of people. So any normative system, any culture that has developed a set of norms around its values and principles and attitudes will create paradoxes. So in the co-op model, they talk about equality and equity. Now, equity is slightly different from equality. They aren't necessarily reconciled. It might be equitable that a person who has worked somewhere for 10 years has benefits that exceed those who worked there for a year. But that wouldn't be equal. Yeah. So how do you reconcile equity and equality? And I think also democracy and autonomy. Democracy implies a very open culture, sharing information. Open membership means that anybody who qualifies can join. How do you reconcile that with autonomy, the right of groups of people to take their own decision, free from the influence of government and other businesses and the like? So the amount of democracy might compromise autonomy too. So what I want you to take away from this is there's a distinction between values that are like internalized attitudes, ethical values, the things that are grounded in moral philosophy, and then the principles that you apply in order to embed your values into practice. So I encourage you to download the guidance and look at the other principles as well. So here are some important resources for studying the wider cooperative movement. There's a research archive, a research committee. We have our own website connected to the FairShares Institute. We've got those are the guidance notes, and there's also a college in Manchester that you might want to look at the website of that college. So let's now move on to the work that we do in the FairShares Institute. There are values and principles behind the FairShares model, and I'll show you how these are connected to the cooperative movement. But first of all, let's look at how the members of the FairShares Association see their own connection to the cooperative movement. So Robert Owen was a person who influenced the Rochdale pioneers. Some of the Rochdale pioneers called themselves Owenites. So they read the works of Owen, they internalized the values that he was arguing for, and they tried to operationalize them in their cooperative for consumers, consumer cooperative. He was also an influence on Father Arizmendiaretta, who was an activist in the worker co-op movement. He was a key influence on Mondragon. I think David may have mentioned Mondragon in an earlier lecture. But also in the UK, we've got John Speedon Lewis, the founder of the John Lewis Partnership. He converted a family business to an employee-owned business, and he did it through a slightly different route. Nevertheless, John Lewis is considered to be part of the co-op movement, and he certainly talked about creating an association of producers. These people are cooperative social entrepreneurs, and they all took their inspiration in some measure from Robert Owen. But we know them today because of the stories told by George Holyoake. So it wasn't enough for them to exist. Those stories, the symbols, the language, the culture was passed into the wider movement by George Holyoake, and today the cooperative group is the contemporary expression. The Mondragon co-ops if you go to the Mondragon co-ops, they often give you a little book. The book has all the sayings of Father Arizmendiaretta. I have a copy at home. So his sayings, his stories resonate through the culture and are taken as not gospel, but important guides to how you enact values and principles. And John Speed and Lewis did the same at the John Lewis Partnership. David found they have libraries there where they have records from John Speed and Lewis's time. There's a book that we were able to get out that had been written by John Lewis. You can't get it anywhere else. It's in the library at John Lewis Partnership. So there are a couple of people that became important in our work. David Ellerman, who wrote a book called The Democratic Firm. Together with John Speed and Lewis, Arizmendiaretta and Ellerman, David Erdl wrote a book called Beyond the Corporation. David certainly read this book very closely when he was studying employee-owned businesses, as did I. So we've got a tradition of worker cooperation, a tradition of consumer cooperation, and we have social entrepreneurship that helps these organisations to create ethical businesses. So the link to Sheffield Hallam is through summer schools that we ran, and about 15 years ago, is it 15 years ago? Yeah, it's going on for 15 years. We were taking our research, and just under 10 years ago, after running courses over the summer, one student, that's Nikki Dickens, my co-tutor Cliff Southcombe and myself, we wrote a discussion document on 5 values and principles: wealth and power sharing, ethical choices in what to produce, ethical choices in how you produce and retail, making sure that your enterprise has a social purpose and tracks its impact, and also a cooperative democratic model for ownership, governance and management. So some of these are connected to the cooperative movement through the power and wealth sharing, the democratic governance and the ethical practices. Some of them come more from the social enterprise movement and sustainable development, so it's an amalgam. So we created an association in 2015, and then we created the FairShares Institute in 2017. So these values and principles in a little bit more detail now. Wealth and power sharing is from the way you structure companies, cooperative societies, associations, partnerships, to advance equality and equity. There's the link back to the ethical values of the cooperative movement. Wealth created is shared amongst founders, those who create the business, producers, those who work there or produce the goods and services, users, often customers, people who use the goods and services, and investors, people who've put money in to promote and fund the business. Social purpose is an auditing of impacts. So if you say that you're going to make specific improvements to members' welfare, the community, the wider environment, the auditing of those impacts is what enables you to evidence the claim. Now, ethics. You've been looking at ethics with David and with Jeanette. There are 2 sides to ethics. There's the ethics of what you produce. Is what I produce good for people, society? And then is the way that I produce good for people and society? And is the way that I sell them good? Do I encourage people to buy the one that gives me the biggest profit margin, or do I encourage people to buy the best product for them? Sometimes the 2 don't coincide. And then lastly, the structuring through social democratic ownership, governance and management. So people have a right to participate in decisions on how the wealth, be it natural, human, social, intellectually, economic and financial, I'll come back to those, how the wealth is managed and used. So we make a connection with each of the FairShares principles to cooperative principles and values and ethics. So wealth and power sharing comes from open membership, democratic member control and participation in the ownership. The social purpose and auditing comes from the value of honesty autonomy and independence requires that you set your own purposes. You don't take your purposes from another organisation. You have your own autonomous purposes. Caring for others, social responsibility features in the ethical review of what you offer and how you produce it. Comes through the principle of concern for community. And then we've got the democratic member control, member economic participation, also in the social democratic ownership, governance and management. So the values of equity, equality and solidarity come through the ownership system too, and indeed through the wealth and power sharing. So we make these connections, and you can read more on the FairShares wiki. So David and I got involved in a 3-year project called FairShares Labs. These are incubators for FairShares enterprises. And in that project, the partners took the values and principles and turned them into questions. So give an example. If I'm going to do an ethical review of the choice of goods and services, I then need to ask myself, what values and principles guide the choice of goods and services that we offer? What values and principles guide the way that we produce and the way that we encourage consumption? If we're going to do democratic control, I need to know who my stakeholders are, and I need to know how the social, environmental and economic impact is going to be reviewed by those stakeholders. So this was an attempt to operationalize the values. And if you take each of these questions, it then becomes clear that different people might be able to answer them. So a question of the purposes of the enterprise is going to be answered probably by the founders of that enterprise. They'll probably have clear answers to the question of how to review as well. But if it's what about production consumption, it's likely that your workforce will be better able to answer the values and principles that are guiding production than your founders are. These are the ones that the labour force lives them. The founders might speak of them, the labour force live them. The users, the customers, live with the value and principles that are implicit in the goods and services. So are you asking your customers what they need, what they want, what will improve their well-being, what will improve their health? You take your lead from your users or your customers. There can be different legal choices as well. So having adopted a multi-stakeholder view, if I want to fund through share offers, I go to company law or cooperative law. If I want access to public or charitable funding, I have to become an association or a charity. All of these options, though, you can get funding from members. So whether I'm a company, a co-op, a partnership, an association or a charity, I can always ask members to contribute funds towards it. And we distinguish between those FairShares enterprises that are more oriented towards protecting labour, so what employee owned businesses and worker co-ops, and then those that are more oriented, those that are more oriented towards the users and customers. But actually, most of the work of the FairShares Association is in this, so towards multi-stakeholding, solidarity enterprises, solidarity co-ops, in which all 4 stakeholders are enfranchised, and that's the model rules that have been produced for creating FairShares enterprises have all 4 stakeholders, and the role play that you will be doing later has 4 stakeholders. Now that's the first iteration. The second iteration, or I say actually technically it's the third iteration of FairShares, the concept of wealth was reframed. And this is the connection and the influence of the arguments around sustainable development. The 6 capitals that are listed here are identified in the work of the International Integrated Reporting Council. But Maureen McCulloch, who is one of our PhD students, and myself have now submitted this paper to a journal where we talk about natural, human, social, intellectual, manufactured and financial wealth. And we talk about where they reside, and it's the access to these forms of wealth that the enterprise creates. So an enterprise may create access to natural wealth, or create human wealth, or create social wealth, create intellectual wealth. The university obviously is concerned with creating intellectual wealth and making it available to people. A lot of businesses create manufactured wealth. They produce consumer goods, and then some businesses create financial wealth. So investment companies help people create financial wealth. But the extent to which a company creates all these forms of wealth indicates whether they're contributing to sustainable development. If they're prioritizing one over the others, then they are not. So in the FairShares paper that we've asked you to read, the one co-authored by David and myself with Maureen on wealth, you'll find this figure. And the argument here is that economy is embedded in society, society is embedded in the environment. So everything starts from the outermost circle, the natural wealth. Our communities are part of nature, our human beings are part of nature, their biology, their physiology, their psychology are all determined by nature. And we use our skills and abilities and our relationships to develop intellectual ideas that we embed in products, and we sell some of those products in order to generate financial wealth. And when we have financial wealth, we reinvest it in our relationships, our skills, our intellectual ideas, and back into the protection of the environment. So it's a model of a circular economy, and this is embedded in the documentation on how to incubate a FairShares enterprise. So there's a link not just from FairShares values and principles to cooperative values and principles. There's also a link from FairShares forms of wealth to sustainable development goals. The commitment to create natural wealth is a commitment to things like climate action, protecting the life on land, protecting life in the water sanitation. Over here, the commitment to financial wealth is to eliminate poverty and to have inclusive economic growth where people share in the wealth that is generated. Manufactured wealth comes in the form of clean energy, industry, production and consumption, cities and communities, the building of cities and communities. Social wealth comes from gender equality, reduced inequality between people of different ethnic communities, partnership. This is the way we map FairShares to sustainable development goals. So just to summarise and finish the lecture, we've evaluated how values come into being through behavioural norms, attitudinal norms, and how they're propagated through stories, symbols, systems, practices, the isomorphism that we talked about, to create a paradigm, a worldview that is a rich mix of stories and symbols and narratives that we propagate and teach people in our communities. That might be coercive, it might be normative, it might be mimetic through imitation. But in any case, the tendency is to normalise, standardise behaviours and attitudes within the community, and to edge towards a unitary culture. Now, pluralism, particularly communitarian pluralism, seeks to limit the development of a normative culture. Cooperative values and principles is a very decentralized movement. There's a lot of autonomy, so it acts against isomorphism, but is itself a set of values and principles which have been agreed and evolved internationally for 150 years. So there is a degree of normativity in the cooperative movement. FairShares is a particular influence on cooperative development, and it encourages more sustainable development within co-ops, or to structure co-ops with values and principles that lead towards sustainable development. So we'll look at FairShares more when I talk to you about managing multiple interests, through multi-stakeholder design principles. But for now, here are some resources you can use for FairShares. So there's a page in which we collect, I've been collecting all the publications that people have put out, where we created videos, both my own and others. We have our FairShares Institute. There's a book that's recommended. It's not compulsory. The articles we've put on the website are compulsory, but the book is optional. There's also a course. If you want to study FairShares more, you can go through a self-study course, and you can log in as a guest to look at the materials if you don't want to enroll. Okay, thanks very much, and I will see you in the seminars.